In the mountains of western North Carolina stands a house that represents the absolute peak of private wealth in American history. Biltmore Estate was not simply a home. It was an economic statement, a political accident, and a historical anomaly created during a brief moment when extreme wealth faced almost no limits. A single individual could command vast inherited fortunes, cheap labor, minimal taxation, and social acceptance of excess, all at the same time. That world no longer exists. Biltmore was built at the precise intersection of conditions that will never align again. It required untaxed fortunes measured in the tens of millions when that amount represented control over entire industries. It depended on a labor system built around domestic service, low wages, and limited worker protections. It relied on land values so depressed that one man could quietly acquire 125,000 acres without scrutiny. And it emerged before income tax, estate tax, and progressive regulation fundamentally altered the relationship between private wealth and public accountability. This documentary examines why no modern billionaire, not even the richest individuals in history, will ever build another Biltmore. Not because today's elites lack money, ambition, or technical capability, but because the incentives that once rewarded monumental displays of private wealth have been dismantled and replaced with systems that punish visibility and reward concealment. The mansion did not disappear because wealth vanished. It disappeared because it became economically irrational, politically dangerous, and strategically obsolete. What replaced it reveals more about modern inequality than the palaces of the Gilded Age ever could. The billionaires are still here. Their fortunes are larger than anything George Vanderbilt could have imagined. But instead of building monuments, you can see, they invest in structures of power that operate quietly, legally, and largely out of public view. Before we begin, if you enjoy deep dive documentaries that examine wealth, power, history, and the forces that shape the modern world, make sure to subscribe. New documentaries are released regularly, and subscribing helps ensure you don't miss the next one. In the late 19th century, the United States experienced a concentration of private wealth that had no historical precedent. Industrialization had moved faster than regulation. Railroads, steel, oil, banking, and shipping produced fortunes so large that they overwhelmed the political and economic systems designed to contain them. A small group of families accumulated wealth at a scale that made governments seem modest by comparison. This was the environment that allowed the construction of estates like Biltmore. It was not simply a matter of personal taste or architectural ambition. It was the outcome of a specific economic structure that existed briefly and then collapsed under its own weight. George Vanderbilt did not build Biltmore because he was uniquely extravagant. He built it because, at that moment in history, the rules made such a project logical. Inherited wealth was largely untaxed. Federal income tax did not exist. Estate taxes were minimal or non-existent. Property taxes were modest and inconsistently enforced. A fortune could be spent without triggering any systematic public response. Wealth could remain concentrated across generations with little interference from the state. The legal framework treated private capital as sacrosanct, and the political system had not yet developed the tools or the will to challenge it. Labor conditions were equally critical. Biltmore required thousands of workers to construct and dozens to operate indefinitely. This was possible only because labor was cheap, abundant, and politically weak. The American South, still economically devastated after the Civil War, offered a workforce desperate for employment. Skilled craftsmen could be recruited from Europe at wages far below what similar work would command today. Domestic service was a normalized occupation for young men and women with few alternatives. There were no minimum wage laws, no overtime protections, no standardized working hour limits. The human cost of maintaining a palace was invisible to those who could afford it. Land values also played a decisive role. Vanderbilt acquired more than 125,000 acres around Asheville at prices that would be unimaginable today. Much of the land had been logged or farmed into exhaustion and was considered economically marginal. Local landowners, struggling for liquidity, sold willingly. There was little public scrutiny, no zoning framework to restrict consolidation, and no cultural resistance to a single individual controlling territory larger than many American cities. The scale of the acquisition did not provoke outrage because the mechanisms for public outrage had not yet fully formed. Most importantly, society accepted monumental displays of private wealth as symbols of national progress. Mansions were framed as proof of American success rather than evidence of structural inequality. Newspapers covered them with awe rather than criticism. Architects, craftsmen, and suppliers treated such projects as professional triumphs. The elite social order revolved around these houses, reinforcing the idea that wealth deserved architectural expression. A palace was not a liability. It was a credential. That consensus did not last. By the time Biltmore was completed in 1895, the foundations of the system that made it possible were already eroding. The Panic of 1893 exposed the fragility of unregulated capitalism. Millions lost jobs, while industrialists remained insulated by inherited wealth. Labor unrest intensified. Strikes became violent. Public anger shifted from admiration to suspicion. Progressive reformers began questioning whether concentrated wealth was compatible with democratic stability. Journalists started investigating monopolies. Politicians sensed opportunity in challenging the unchecked power of the elite. The most consequential shift came not from cultural change, but from law. In 1913, the ratification of the 16th Amendment permanently altered American wealth. For the first time, the federal government gained unquestioned authority to tax income. The initial rates were modest, but the precedent was revolutionary. Wealth was no longer invisible to the state. Income could be measured, tracked, and claimed. The First World War accelerated this transformation dramatically. Financing total war required unprecedented revenue. Top marginal tax rates rose rapidly, reaching levels that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. This alone would have made another Biltmore unlikely. A house that consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to operate became untenable once the majority of income was claimed by taxation. But income tax was only the beginning. Estate taxes ensured that even if a fortune survived during one lifetime, it would be fractured at death. Property taxes escalated as local governments sought stable revenue sources. The cost of holding land increased year after year, regardless of whether it produced income. At the same time, the labor system collapsed. Domestic service declined sharply after World War I. Industrial and clerical jobs offered better wages, more independence, and greater social mobility. Young people no longer accepted lives of invisible labor inside private homes. Even families who could theoretically afford large staffs found it increasingly difficult to hire and retain workers. Labor laws formalized these changes, raising wages and imposing protections that made large household staffs economically irrational. Technology softened the blow, but could not solve the core problem. Modern appliances reduced labor needs, but they did not reduce scale. A 250-room house still required heating, maintenance, security, and constant repair. The fixed costs remained enormous. The mansion became a machine that consumed wealth rather than expressing it. By the 1930s, the conclusion was unavoidable. The economic model of the private palace had failed. Families faced a choice: preserve the building and destroy the fortune, or preserve the fortune and destroy the building. Most chose demolition. Urban land had become too valuable to support single-family estates. Apartment buildings, offices, and hotels produced income that mansions never could. Real estate logic replaced aristocratic symbolism. This history explains why no modern billionaire will ever build another Biltmore, regardless of how much wealth they control. Today's richest individuals possess fortunes that dwarf those of the Gilded Age. In absolute terms, they could easily fund projects of comparable scale. But the incentives that guide their decisions are entirely different. Visibility is now a liability. A palace announces its owner to tax authorities, political movements, activists, criminals, and the media. It invites scrutiny that modern wealth is structured specifically to avoid. Property assessments rise, public resentment grows, security risks multiply. The building itself becomes evidence in debates about inequality. For a modern billionaire, constructing a monumental residence creates more problems than it solves. Modern wealth prioritizes flexibility. Capital is deployed across portfolios, jurisdictions, and legal structures designed to minimize exposure. Assets are held through limited liability companies and trusts that obscure ownership. Residences are distributed across multiple properties rather than concentrated in a single location. Privacy, not grandeur, is the primary objective. Control replaces display. There is also no cultural reward for building a palace. Society no longer interprets such acts as admirable. A billionaire who announces plans for a 250-room mansion would face immediate backlash. The project would be framed as obscene rather than impressive. Political actors would seize on it as evidence of systemic failure. Regulatory attention would follow. The mansion would become a liability before it was even completed. Perhaps most importantly, the mansion no longer represents power. In the Gilded Age, physical presence mattered. A house dominated its surroundings. It anchored social networks. It symbolized permanence. Today, power operates through systems rather than structures. Control over platforms, data, capital flows, media, and policy shapes society far more effectively than architecture ever could. A foundation, a corporation, or a digital platform exerts influence continuously and invisibly. A mansion does nothing once it is built. Biltmore survives precisely because it abandoned its original purpose. It became a museum, a business, and a tourist destination. It generates revenue, employs thousands, and functions as cultural infrastructure. It no longer competes with modern wealth. It documents a moment when wealth still believed permanence could be built in stone. That belief no longer exists. Modern billionaires do not build monuments because monuments are fragile. They can be taxed, criticized, photographed, and eventually dismantled. Instead, wealth flows into structures that leave no architectural record. The absence of new Biltmores is not a mystery. It is the clearest evidence that wealth has learned how to survive by disappearing from view. This is why no billionaire will ever build a mansion like Biltmore again. Not because they cannot, but because doing so would represent a failure to understand the modern rules of power. By the middle of the 20th century, the disappearance of the great American mansion was complete, but the lesson it taught the wealthy went far beyond architecture. It reshaped how power itself would be exercised. The failure of the mansion was not simply economic, it was psychological. It revealed that visibility had become dangerous, permanence had become illusory, and scale had become a liability rather than an advantage. The Gilded Age elite believed that wealth should be made visible because visibility reinforced legitimacy. A palace anchored a family to a place and announced permanence to society. It told the public that the owner expected to remain powerful, unchallenged, and respected for generations. The house was not only a residence, it was a declaration of confidence in the future. The modern billionaire holds no such confidence. This shift begins with an uncomfortable truth. The late 20th and early 21st centuries produced greater wealth concentration than the Gilded Age ever achieved, but that wealth emerged in a far less stable social environment. The industrial barons of Vanderbilt's era faced labor unrest, but they did not face instant mass communication, global media scrutiny, or real-time political mobilization. Their excesses were visible, but outrage moved slowly. Newspapers printed editorials. Reformers organized over years. Change came through gradual pressure. Modern wealth exists under constant observation. A single viral image can trigger global backlash within hours. A leaked document can provoke congressional hearings. A conspicuous purchase can become a political symbol overnight. The feedback loop between wealth and public reaction is immediate and unforgiving. In this environment, building a palace is not an expression of strength. It is an invitation to conflict. Security concerns alone make the idea untenable. The kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's infant son in 1932 permanently altered elite behavior. Wealth became associated with vulnerability rather than prestige. Over the decades that followed, threats multiplied. Political extremism, organized crime, stalkers, and unstable individuals all learned to target the wealthy. A monumental residence advertises location, routine, and importance. It centralizes risk. Modern security strategy disperses it. That is why contemporary elite residences are fragmented. Multiple properties in different jurisdictions reduce exposure. Corporate ownership structures create distance between individual and asset. Compounds are shielded by natural barriers, controlled access, and legal opacity. Even when modern billionaires own vast amounts of residential real estate, it is intentionally unremarkable from the outside. Grandeur has been replaced by concealment. Taxation reinforces this behavior. A mansion like Biltmore is a tax disaster by modern standards. Its assessed value would generate enormous property tax obligations. Its visibility would invite aggressive reassessment. Its operating costs would not be deductible as business expenses. Its transfer across generations would trigger estate taxes at multiple levels. It would become a fiscal liability that consumes wealth rather than preserving it. By contrast, wealth deployed through financial instruments enjoys flexibility. Capital gains can be deferred. Losses can be offset. Assets can be shifted across jurisdictions. Ownership can be layered through trusts, partnerships, and foundations. The tax code rewards mobility, abstraction, and complexity. It punishes permanence, simplicity, and visibility. A mansion represents the worst possible alignment with modern fiscal incentives. This explains why contemporary elite architecture favors campuses, ranches, islands, and compounds rather than palaces. These structures are not designed to impress outsiders. They are designed to control space. A ranch spanning hundreds of thousands of acres provides security through distance. An island offers isolation without ostentation. A corporate campus blends residence with work, justifying scale through productivity rather than luxury. Each approach reframes ownership as functional rather than symbolic. The mansion, by contrast, offers no justification beyond display. Cultural values have shifted accordingly. The Gilded age equated size with success. Bigger meant stronger, richer, more legitimate. Modern elite culture equates discretion with intelligence. The billionaire who avoids attention is perceived as savvy rather than timid. Restraint is framed as wisdom. Excess is framed as insecurity. This inversion is crucial. It ensures that even when wealth grows, its outward expression shrinks. There is also the question of time. Vanderbilt built Biltmore expecting it to last centuries. Modern elites do not plan that way. Technology changes too fast. Markets shift too unpredictably. Political environments evolve too quickly. Permanence has become a liability. A fixed monument ties wealth to a single place and era. Flexible systems allow adaptation. The modern billionaire expects disruption, not continuity. This mindset extends to philanthropy, which has replaced architecture as the preferred expression of legacy. Foundations offer permanence without visibility. They can exist indefinitely, influence policy globally, and shape future generations without ever producing a physical monument. Their buildings, when they exist at all, are offices rather than palaces. Their power lies in capital deployment, not stone. Philanthropy also provides moral insulation. A mansion invites criticism because it serves no public purpose. A foundation reframes wealth as benevolent even when its influence is enormous. It allows elites to claim social contribution while retaining control. This strategy did not exist in its modern form during Vanderbilt's lifetime. It is one of the key reasons architectural monuments became unnecessary. Media ownership fulfills a similar role. Controlling narratives is more powerful than commanding space. A newspaper, television network, or digital platform shapes perception at scale. Its influence reaches millions or billions. A mansion influences only those who see it. In a world driven by information, architecture is a blunt instrument. This is why modern billionaires invest in platforms rather than palaces. Platforms scale infinitely. Buildings do not. The disappearance of the mansion also reflects a deeper psychological transformation. Gilded Age elites believed their dominance was natural and permanent. They saw themselves as inheritors of a stable social order. Modern elites operate with an undercurrent of anxiety. They are acutely aware that their wealth exists within systems that could turn against them. Regulation, taxation, antitrust action, and political movements all pose existential risks. This anxiety manifests architecturally as defensiveness. Walls replace facades. Distance replaces spectacle. Underground bunkers replace grand halls. The evolution from palace to compound to bunker is not symbolic. It is literal. It reflects a shift from confidence to caution. The irony is that modern wealth is objectively more powerful than Gilded Age wealth ever was. It controls infrastructure rather than territory. It shapes communication rather than society circles. It influences policy rather than merely lobbying it. Yet, it does so invisibly. This invisibility protects wealth but undermines accountability. Biltmore still stands because it became visible in a new way. It invited the public inside. It transformed from a private assertion of dominance into a shared cultural artifact. Modern elite structures are designed to prevent that transformation. They are meant to disappear, not endure. This raises a fundamental question about legacy. Vanderbilt's mansion failed as a residence, but succeeded as a monument. It created something that outlived its original purpose. Modern billionaires may wield greater power, but they produce fewer artifacts. Their influence is embedded in systems that may vanish without leaving physical traces. Platforms can be deleted. Foundations can be dissolved. Financial instruments leave no ruins. Future historians may struggle to document modern wealth in the same way we document the Gilded Age. There will be fewer buildings to study, fewer rooms to walk through, fewer objects to examine. Power will be inferred from data rather than encountered in space. This is why no billionaire will ever build another Biltmore. The mansion belongs to a moment when wealth still believed it could be seen without consequence. That belief was destroyed by taxation, regulation, public backlash, and historical experience. Modern wealth has learned that survival depends on invisibility. The question that remains is not architectural, it is political. A society that cannot see its concentrations of power struggles to challenge them. The Gilded Age was offensive, but it was legible. The modern era is efficient, but opaque. Biltmore endures as a reminder of a time when wealth left footprints large enough for history to follow. In the next section, the focus shifts from why the mansion disappeared to what replaced it completely. Not the houses modern billionaires live in, but the systems they inhabit, control, and quietly expand. The systems that replaced the mansion did not emerge accidentally. They evolved deliberately, shaped by law, technology, and hard lessons learned from the collapse of the Gilded Age. Where Vanderbilt invested in stone, land, and craftsmanship, modern billionaires invest in abstraction. Where Biltmore concentrated wealth in a single visible location, modern wealth disperses itself across layers designed to obscure ownership, reduce friction, and preserve control. The most important replacement for the mansion is not a house at all. It is the legal entity. Limited liability companies, trusts, shell corporations, foundations, and holding companies now perform the function that palaces once served. They are the containers of wealth, the shields against scrutiny, and the mechanisms through which power is exercised. Unlike a mansion, these structures have no facade to photograph, no address to protest, and no single jurisdiction that can easily regulate them. They are portable, adaptable, and resilient. In the Gilded Age, power radiated outward from physical presence. The owner lived at the center. Guests traveled to the house. Business relationships were reinforced through dinners, balls, and social rituals that required proximity. The mansion was a hub. Modern power does not require proximity. It requires access. Digital infrastructure, financial networks, and institutional relationships replace drawing rooms and banquet halls. Influence travels electronically, legally, and instantaneously. This shift fundamentally alters how elites interact with society. Vanderbilt's wealth was obvious. It stood on a hill, surrounded by forests he owned, staffed by servants he employed, and built by laborers he paid directly. His power was visible because it was embodied. Modern power is mediated. It flows through platforms, algorithms, contracts, and policy frameworks that are difficult for the public to trace back to, individuals. This is not an accident. It is a survival strategy. Antitrust law dismantled the overt monopolies of the early 20th century, but it did not eliminate concentration. It transformed it. Vertical integration gave way to platform dominance. Control shifted from ownership of physical assets to control of networks. Railroads gave way to cloud computing. Oil refineries gave way to data centers. Steel mills gave way to intellectual property portfolios. These forms of power do not require architectural monuments. They require regulatory insulation. Modern billionaires understand that architecture creates permanence, and permanence creates vulnerability. A building can be taxed, landmarked, regulated, or seized. A platform can be restructured, rebranded, spun off, or sold. Capital can move faster than law. Stone cannot. This logic extends even to how modern elites think about geography. The Gilded Age elite clustered physically. Fifth Avenue, Newport, Palm Beach. Proximity reinforced hierarchy. Today's elite are geographically fragmented by design. Residences are spread across states and countries, chosen for tax efficiency, legal predictability, and political climate. Mobility itself is power. The ability to leave becomes leverage. A palace anchors you. A portfolio frees you. Even when modern billionaires do invest in large physical spaces, those spaces are framed as something other than residences. Ranches are described as conservation projects. Islands are framed as tourism investments. Campuses are justified as workplaces. Each framing provides legal, tax, and reputational insulation. The structure exists, but its purpose is masked. It is never allowed to appear as a monument to private indulgence. This distinction matters. A mansion exists purely to serve its owner. That is why it became indefensible. Modern elite spaces are always presented as productive, benevolent, or strategic. They must justify themselves within a system that no longer tolerates naked excess. The replacement of the mansion also reflects a change in how elites think about legacy. Vanderbilt assumed his descendants would want to live where he lived. He imagined continuity through place. Modern elites assume the opposite. They expect their descendants to live differently, work differently, and move freely. Legacy is no longer a house. It is an endowment, a controlling interest, or a governance structure. This is why modern dynastic wealth focuses on governance rather than habitation. Trusts dictate how capital is used. Boards determine strategy. Lawyers replace architects. Accountants replace landscapers. The aesthetic dimension disappears, replaced by procedural control. This transformation has consequences beyond elite culture. It reshapes how inequality functions in society. When wealth is embodied in buildings, it is legible. It creates physical contrast between rich and poor that can be seen, photographed, and challenged. When wealth is abstracted into financial instruments and digital platforms, it becomes harder to grasp. Inequality persists, but its evidence is dispersed. This dispersal weakens democratic response. It is easier to mobilize against a mansion than against an algorithm. It is easier to tax a building than to trace assets through layered entities. It is easier to regulate a factory than to regulate influence exercised through lobbying, philanthropy, and media ownership. The disappearance of the mansion did not solve inequality. It changed its visibility. Biltmore stands today as an anomaly because it failed to adapt fast enough. It remained physical in a world that moved toward abstraction. Its survival required surrendering privacy and becoming public. Most modern elite structures are designed to avoid that fate entirely. They are built to resist exposure, not invite it. This also explains why contemporary luxury architecture, even at its most expensive, avoids monumental scale. Modern mansions may feature cutting-edge technology, rare materials, and extensive amenities, but they rarely exceed certain size thresholds. There is an unspoken ceiling beyond which architecture becomes politically dangerous. Designers, lawyers, and public relations teams all understand this constraint. The limit is not economic. It is reputational. A billionaire could commission a 250-room residence tomorrow. The problem is not feasibility. The problem is consequence. The building would dominate news cycles. It would attract scrutiny from tax authorities. It would become a symbol in political campaigns. It would invite regulation, not just of the building, but of the fortune behind it. In a world where wealth preservation depends on minimizing attention, such a move would be irrational. The mansion died not because billionaires became modest, but because they became strategic. This strategic mindset extends to how elites interact with the public. In the Gilded Age, access to the elite was controlled through social rituals and physical spaces. Today, access is mediated through institutions. Foundations fund research. Media platforms shape discourse. Political donations influence policy. The elite no longer host society. They fund it. This shift creates a different kind of asymmetry. The public may visit Biltmore and understand, viscerally, what concentrated wealth once looked like. There is no equivalent experience for modern power. You cannot tour an algorithm. You cannot walk through a tax structure. You cannot photograph a lobbying strategy. Power has become experiential only to those who wield it. That is why Biltmore remains compelling. It is legible. It tells a story that can be physically encountered. Modern wealth tells stories through press releases, white papers, and curated narratives rather than architecture. The long-term implication is cultural loss. The crafts that built Biltmore disappeared because the demand for such structures vanished. Stone carvers, plasterers, metalworkers, and master woodworkers lost their market. Their skills were replaced by industrialized construction methods optimized for efficiency rather than permanence. Even if a modern billionaire wanted to recreate Biltmore exactly, the human infrastructure to do so barely exists. But the deeper loss is symbolic. The mansion represented a belief that wealth should leave something behind. Modern wealth prioritizes survival over symbolism. It leaves fewer artifacts for future generations to interpret. Historians of the future may know today's billionaires primarily through financial records and digital archives rather than physical remains. This makes Biltmore not just a house, but a warning. It shows what happens when wealth believes itself untouchable. It also shows what happens when society decides that such visibility is no longer acceptable. The mansion was a casualty of that decision. Modern elites have absorbed that lesson completely. They have built a world where power no longer requires monuments. Whether that world is more just, more stable, or more accountable than the one that produced Biltmore is an open question. What is certain is this: no billionaire will ever build a mansion like Biltmore again, because doing so would mean misunderstanding how power now works. The house was the perfect expression of its time. This is no longer that time. The disappearance of the mansion also signals a change in how elites understand risk. For Vanderbilt, risk was economic. Railroads could fail, markets could crash, but the underlying assumption was continuity. Even after panics and depressions, the social order endured. Wealthy families expected to recover. A mansion was a hedge against uncertainty, a tangible anchor in a volatile economy. Modern elites perceive risk differently. The primary threats are not market cycles, but systemic disruption. Political backlash, regulatory overreach, technological displacement, and social unrest are treated as constant possibilities rather than remote dangers. In that environment, immobility becomes hazardous. A palace fixes wealth in place. It ties identity, assets, and daily life to a single location that can be targeted symbolically or physically. This is why modern wealth behaves like liquid. It flows, it relocates, it avoids friction. The mansion, by contrast, is solid. It resists movement. That resistance once symbolized strength. Now it signals vulnerability. The rise of global finance intensified this shift. Vanderbilt's wealth, though immense, was primarily national. Railroads ran across the United States. His investments were embedded in American infrastructure. Modern fortunes are global by default. Capital moves instantly across borders. Corporations operate in dozens of jurisdictions simultaneously. Supply chains span continents. A single building, no matter how grand, cannot reflect or support that complexity. Global wealth requires global optionality. A mansion provides none. This explains why the ultra-wealthy increasingly favor assets that double as exit strategies. Multiple residences across countries provide legal flexibility. Citizenship by investment programs offer mobility. Private aircraft eliminate dependence on public infrastructure. None of these investments are about luxury in the traditional sense. They are about control under uncertainty. The mansion represents the opposite philosophy. It assumes stability. It assumes acceptance. It assumes that the owner's right to occupy space will remain uncontested. Those assumptions no longer hold. The political environment reinforces this reality. Democratic societies tolerate inequality only when it remains abstract or justified. When inequality becomes visible and personal, it provokes reaction. The Gilded Age demonstrated this clearly. The progressive era did not emerge from theory. It emerged from anger at visible excess. Mansions provided a focal point for that anger. Modern elites have learned to avoid focal points. Instead of one obvious target, wealth now fragments itself into thousands of smaller, less visible components. Each individual element appears reasonable. A foundation grant, a campaign donation, a corporate acquisition, a real estate holding company. None provoke outrage alone. Together, they represent power at a scale far greater than Vanderbilt's, but without a single symbol around which opposition can organize. This strategy is not accidental. It is institutional knowledge passed through advisors, lawyers, and wealth managers. The lesson of the mansion's demise is embedded in modern elite behavior. Do not build anything that can be pointed at. Architecture once played a central role in legitimizing wealth. Palaces, estates, and grand residences communicated taste, refinement, and permanence. Today, legitimacy is constructed differently. It is curated through philanthropy, innovation narratives, and media presence. The billionaire is framed not as an aristocrat, but as a problem solver, a disruptor, a visionary. A palace undermines that narrative. It reverts the billionaire to an older archetype, the idle inheritor, the feudal lord, the detached elite. Even when modern billionaires are self-made, architecture can make them appear otherwise. A mansion erases the story of innovation and replaces it with the image of excess. This is why contemporary elite residences often adopt architectural languages that emphasize restraint, clean lines, neutral materials, integration with landscape. Even at enormous cost, the aesthetic avoids spectacle. The goal is to appear modern, rational, and efficient rather than dominant. Biltmore did the opposite. It was designed to dominate its environment. It rose above the landscape, commanding attention. It framed nature as an extension of ownership. That approach no longer aligns with modern sensibilities, even among the wealthy themselves. Environmental consciousness also plays a role. Large, inefficient buildings conflict with contemporary narratives about sustainability. Even when those narratives are selectively applied, they matter symbolically. A 250-room mansion is difficult to defend in an era of climate anxiety and environmental awareness. A ranch framed as conservation land or a campus marketed as energy efficient is easier to justify. Again, the issue is not actual impact. It is perception. The mansion's failure was as much reputational as economic. Once public sentiment turned, the structure became indefensible. Modern elites prioritize reputational resilience. They invest heavily in shaping how their actions are interpreted. Architecture that invites criticism undermines that effort. There is also a generational dimension. Vanderbilt belonged to a lineage that valued inheritance as identity. His name, his family, his legacy were inseparable from place. Modern elites often come from technological or financial sectors that value adaptability over lineage. Their identities are tied to companies, platforms, or ideas rather than geography. This affects how they think about home. Home is no longer a seat of power. It is a base of operations, interchangeable and secondary. Work defines identity more than residence. The campus, the office, the network matter more than the house. In this context, the mansion appears archaic. It reflects a worldview in which status is anchored in place. Modern status is anchored in influence. The result is a paradox. Wealth has grown more concentrated, but its physical footprint has shrunk. Power has expanded, but its monuments have disappeared. Biltmore endures because it belongs to a time when wealth still believed it needed to be seen to be real. That belief is gone. What remains is a system optimized for endurance rather than display. It sacrifices grandeur for survivability. It trades stone for contracts, halls for servers, estates for networks. From the perspective of the wealthy, this is progress. From the perspective of society, it creates new challenges. A mansion can be taxed, a platform can lobby, a building can be seized, an algorithm can be modified quietly. Visibility once made accountability possible. Invisibility complicates it. Biltmore stands today as a relic of visible power. Visitors walk through rooms designed to impress and intimidate. They experience the scale of inequality directly. That experience shapes understanding in ways no statistic can. Modern wealth offers no equivalent encounter. This is why the absence of new Biltmores matters. It is not just an architectural shift, it is a transformation in how power relates to society. The mansion was a declaration. Modern wealth prefers implication. And that is why no billionaire will ever build a mansion like Biltmore again. Not because the age of excess ended, but because excess learned how to disappear. The final transformation lies not in architecture, law, or technology, but in expectation. George Vanderbilt expected gratitude. He expected admiration. He expected that what he built would be understood as a contribution to civilization itself. That assumption defined the Gilded Age mindset. Wealth was justified by creation. If you built something magnificent, society would eventually forgive how you acquired the means to do it. That expectation no longer exists. Modern billionaires do not expect admiration from the public. They expect skepticism at best and hostility at worst. They do not assume that visible achievement will legitimize their wealth. They assume the opposite. This psychological reversal is decisive. A person who expects admiration builds monuments. A person who expects resentment builds defenses. This is the quiet reason Biltmore has no successor. The collapse of trust between the public and concentrated wealth did not happen overnight. It accumulated across a century of crises. The Great Depression shattered faith in self-regulating elites. The post-war period temporarily restored balance through high taxation and broad prosperity, but that equilibrium eroded in the late 20th century. Deindustrialization hollowed out communities. Financialization concentrated gains at the top. Technology amplified inequality at unprecedented speed. By the early 21st century, wealth had become untethered from everyday experience for most people. The products people used were free or cheap. The labor that generated profits was hidden in global supply chains. The wealth itself existed primarily as numbers on screens. When inequality surfaced, it did so abstractly, through statistics rather than structures. In this environment, the mansion would be an anomaly. It would translate abstract inequality into physical form. It would make resentment concrete. It would give anger an address. Modern elites are keenly aware of this risk. They live in a world of consultants, advisors, security professionals, and legal strategists whose job is to anticipate backlash before it materializes. Every major decision is evaluated not only for cost and return, but for optics. What story does this action tell? Who might object? How could it be reframed? A 250-room mansion fails this test immediately. There is no framing that rescues it. Even philanthropy, which appears generous, is carefully managed. Donations are announced strategically. Causes are chosen for alignment with public sentiment. Foundations publish impact reports. Messaging emphasizes humility, partnership, and evidence-based outcomes. The goal is not gratitude, but legitimacy. A palace undermines that legitimacy. The irony is that modern billionaires enjoy levels of comfort and control that would have stunned Vanderbilt. Private jets eliminate distance. Encrypted communication ensures privacy. Climate-controlled environments replicate comfort anywhere in the world. Staff numbers may be smaller, but services are outsourced, automated, or contracted globally. Luxury has become modular rather than monumental. The experience of wealth is richer. Its expression is poorer. This modularity extends to housing. Instead of one enormous house, modern elites assemble ecosystems of properties, services, and infrastructure. Residences are nodes rather than centers. They can be activated or abandoned as needed. The mansion, by contrast, demands constant presence. It insists on being central. That insistence is now a liability. There is also the question of succession. Vanderbilt built Biltmore for descendants he assumed would want it. Modern elites are less certain about their heirs. Children may pursue different careers, values, or locations. Divorce, blended families, and complex inheritance arrangements make single-seat dynasties impractical. Wealth planning now assumes fragmentation. Assets must be divisible, portable, and adaptable. A mansion resists division. It creates conflict. It forces choices. This is why modern estate planning avoids singular assets that cannot be easily distributed. Liquid wealth simplifies succession. Governance structures replace inheritance rituals. Trustees replace patriarchs. The family seat becomes symbolic rather than functional, if it exists at all. When modern elites do preserve physical structures, they rarely inhabit them. They turn them into institutions, museums, universities, research centers, public-facing entities that justify preservation while removing personal attachment. This echoes what happened to Biltmore, but now it is anticipated from the beginning. The building is never meant to be home. That anticipation reveals how thoroughly the lesson has been learned. Biltmore was built at the end of an era that still believed in permanence. Its survival required surrendering that belief. Modern wealth begins with the assumption that nothing permanent should be built without an exit plan. This assumption extends beyond residences. Companies are structured for acquisition. Brands are designed for scalability. Careers are planned around optionality. The elite worldview prioritizes flexibility above all else. The mansion represents rigidity. The deeper implication is cultural. Societies tell stories about themselves through their buildings. Castles, cathedrals, palaces, and civic monuments encode values. Biltmore tells a story about confidence, hierarchy, and excess. Modern societies tell their stories through infrastructure, data centers, and digital platforms, most of which are intentionally unremarkable. Future generations may struggle to interpret this era architecturally. There will be few grand ruins to explore. Power will be inferred from archives, not encountered in stone. The emotional impact will be different. Standing inside Biltmore today, visitors feel the weight of inequality immediately. The scale overwhelms. The craftsmanship impresses. The excess is undeniable. It provokes questions without explanation. Modern power does not provoke that reaction, because it rarely occupies space in the same way. This is both an achievement and a loss. The achievement lies in efficiency. Capital is allocated toward activities that generate returns, innovation, and measurable outcomes. The wastefulness of building palaces has largely disappeared. The loss lies in visibility. When power leaves no physical trace, it becomes harder to confront, regulate, or remember. Biltmore survives because it failed as a private project and succeeded as a public artifact. It teaches by existing. Modern wealth teaches only through consequences. The mansion will not return because it solved the wrong problem. It sought to legitimize wealth through visibility. Modern wealth seeks to survive through invisibility. That shift is irreversible under current incentives. If the rules change again, architecture may follow. If taxation strengthens, if regulation tightens, if public demand for accountability intensifies, wealth may once again seek legitimacy through visible contribution. But it is unlikely to take the form of private palaces. The lesson of Biltmore is too deeply embedded. What future elites build, if they build anything monumental at all, will likely be collective rather than private, justified rather than indulgent, framed as public good rather than personal triumph. Or they may build nothing that can be seen. In that sense, Biltmore marks both an end and a warning. It stands as proof that wealth once believed it could carve permanence into stone. It also proves that permanence depends not on resources, but on alignment with society's values. George Vanderbilt built the largest private house in American history. He did so at the exact moment when history stopped allowing such things. No billionaire will ever build another mansion like Biltmore again, because the world learned what happens when wealth becomes too visible. And the wealthy learned how to make sure it never happens to them again. The story does not end with the disappearance of the mansion. It ends with a transformation in how societies negotiate power itself. Biltmore marks the last moment when private wealth attempted to justify its existence through permanence. Everything that followed reflects a retreat from that idea. To understand why this retreat is so complete, it helps to consider what a mansion actually represents in political terms. A palace is not neutral architecture. It is a claim. It asserts that one individual or family deserves exclusive control over extraordinary space, resources, and labor. In monarchies, that claim is formalized through divine right or inherited sovereignty. In republics, it becomes unstable. The Gilded Age tested whether a democratic society could tolerate monarchical symbols without monarchy itself. The answer was no. The United States tolerated inequality as long as it could imagine mobility. As long as wealth appeared earned, temporary, or reinvested into public growth, it was accepted. The moment it hardened into permanent, hereditary form, resentment intensified. Mansions made inequality look permanent. They implied that some families would always live above others, not just economically, but spatially, physically, and culturally. Biltmore did exactly that. It sat above the surrounding region, visible proof that one family occupied a different plane of existence. It was not merely larger than other homes, it was categorically different. That difference mattered. Modern elites are acutely aware of this symbolic danger. They operate in societies that are formally egalitarian, even when inequality is extreme. Any structure that visually contradicts the promise of equality risks destabilizing the narrative that holds the system together. Mansions break that narrative. They remind people that hierarchy exists not just in income brackets, but in lived reality. This is why modern inequality hides behind normalcy. Billionaires dress casually. Their homes appear understated. Their public personas emphasize relatability, innovation, and disruption rather than dominance. This is not accidental. It is performative restraint designed to preserve legitimacy. A mansion cannot perform restraint. The transformation also reflects a shift in how elites view the state. Vanderbilt built Biltmore when the state was weak relative to private capital. Regulation was minimal. Taxation was inconsistent. The federal government did not yet possess the administrative capacity to monitor or control large fortunes effectively. Building a palace did not feel risky because enforcement mechanisms were underdeveloped. That balance has reversed. Modern states possess extensive surveillance, taxation, and regulatory tools. Property records are digitized. Financial flows are tracked. Zoning, environmental review, labor law, and safety regulation intersect in ways that make large private construction projects complex and politically visible. A mansion today would trigger scrutiny from dozens of agencies at multiple levels of government. The process itself would generate publicity and opposition. Modern elites prefer environments where the state interacts with them indirectly, through negotiated frameworks rather than confrontational oversight. Financial instruments allow this. Physical monuments do not. There is also a strategic asymmetry at play. Governments can regulate buildings more easily than systems. A structure exists in one place, under one jurisdiction. A platform operates across borders. A foundation spans countries. A portfolio flows through markets. When power becomes mobile, it gains leverage. When it becomes fixed, it becomes governable. The mansion is governable. This realization has reshaped elite priorities entirely. Wealth now seeks forms that are difficult to define, difficult to locate, and difficult to dismantle. Influence migrates toward areas where accountability mechanisms lag behind innovation. Architecture, by contrast, is one of the oldest and most regulated domains of human activity. In this sense, the end of the mansion is part of a broader pattern. Physical manifestations of power have declined across society. Corporations no longer need headquarters that dominate skylines. Retail giants operate warehouses rather than flagships. Banks occupy servers rather than vaults. The visible symbols of authority recede as power becomes procedural rather than spatial. Biltmore survives because it is frozen in time. It no longer threatens the system that replaced it. It is safe because it is historical. This safety is essential. Societies tolerate symbols of past inequality more readily than symbols of present inequality. A mansion from 1895 can be admired as craftsmanship. A mansion from 2025 would be condemned as provocation. Time neutralizes offense. Modern elites understand this instinctively. They do not build monuments because monuments age into liabilities long before they become heritage. Another factor rarely acknowledged is boredom. The Gilded Age elite needed mansions because social life required them. Entertainment was private, communication was slow. Leisure centered on hosting, visiting, and performing status rituals in physical space. A mansion provided the stage. Modern elites do not need stages. Entertainment is global and instantaneous. Communication requires no hosting. Influence does not depend on salons or dinner parties. It depends on access to networks, data, and capital. The social function of the mansion has evaporated. The result is a hollowing out of domestic grandeur. Homes no longer anchor elite culture. Offices, platforms, and institutions do. When elites gather, they do so at conferences, summits, retreats, and forums designed for efficiency rather than display. The mansion is inefficient. This efficiency mindset also explains why modern luxury prioritizes experience over structure. Travel, exclusivity, access, and time matter more than square footage. A private jet delivers more utility than a ballroom. A secure, digital ecosystem offers more control than a gatehouse. Luxury has become portable. Portability and permanence cannot coexist. The disappearance of the mansion also reveals something unsettling about collective memory. Physical structures anchor history. They allow future generations to encounter the past directly. When power leaves no monuments, it leaves fewer traces. Accountability becomes retrospective rather than experiential. Biltmore teaches precisely because it exists. It allows visitors to confront inequality without abstraction. Modern power does not allow that confrontation. It must be studied indirectly, through data and analysis, rather than space and sensation. This has consequences for how societies respond to inequality. Emotional responses drive political change more effectively than statistics. The Gilded Age reforms were fueled by visible excess. The Progressive Era drew strength from symbols people could see and resent. The absence of modern equivalents weakens mobilization. The mansion was a mistake from the perspective of elite survival, but it was a gift to historical understanding. Modern elites have corrected that mistake thoroughly. This does not mean that monumental building is over entirely. It means that monumentality has shifted domains. Data centers, research facilities, logistics hubs, and infrastructure projects now represent the largest private investments. These structures are massive, but they are framed as functional rather than indulgent. They serve commerce rather than comfort. Even when these projects rival the scale of palaces, they do not provoke the same reaction because they appear productive. The distinction is crucial. Society tolerates scale when it appears to serve collective systems. It rejects scale when it serves individual pleasure. Biltmore failed because it served one man's vision too openly. The final irony is that Biltmore now does what modern elites avoid doing themselves. It makes wealth legible. It creates jobs. It attracts tourism. It contributes visibly to regional identity. It functions as cultural infrastructure. In its afterlife, it aligns with modern expectations of justification. George Vanderbilt did not build Biltmore to justify his wealth. He built it because he could. The house survives because justification became mandatory. That requirement defines the modern era. Wealth must explain itself continuously. It must claim productivity, benevolence, or innovation. It cannot simply exist in excess. This is why no billionaire will ever build a mansion like Biltmore again. The structure itself violates the unwritten rules of modern legitimacy. It claims too much, says too little, and invites too many questions. Standing at Biltmore today, one sees not just a house, but the boundary between two eras. On one side, wealth believed permanence could be carved into stone. On the other, wealth learned that survival depends on remaining unseen. The mansion belongs to the past, because it tells the truth too clearly. The disappearance of the mansion also marks a deeper shift in how wealth relates to morality. In the Gilded Age, excess did not require justification beyond success itself. If a man became rich, society largely assumed he had earned the right to enjoy that wealth as he pleased. Moral judgment focused on character rather than structure. Was he generous, cultured, respectable? The house was an extension of that personal narrative. That moral framework collapsed alongside the mansion. Modern wealth exists under an assumption of suspicion. The question is no longer whether a billionaire is refined or cultured, but whether their wealth extraction harms society. Attention has shifted from manners to mechanisms. How was the fortune made? Who was displaced? What externalities were created? Which regulations were avoided? Which labor was underpaid? The mansion offers no answers to these questions. It only amplifies them. This is why modern elites invest so heavily in narrative control. Wealth now requires a story that explains its existence in socially acceptable terms. Innovation, job creation, climate solutions, global health, education reform. These narratives function as moral scaffolding. They justify accumulation by framing it as a byproduct of progress rather than exploitation. A palace undermines that framing. It suggests that wealth exists for private enjoyment rather than public benefit. Even when that implication is inaccurate, perception dominates reality. Modern elites understand that morality is now negotiated publicly, not privately. A single structure can undo years of narrative management. This sensitivity reflects a broader change in democratic expectations. Citizens no longer accept inequality as an inevitable byproduct of growth. They demand explanation, transparency, accountability. The mansion is mute in the face of those demands. It offers spectacle without argument. That silence is fatal. The modern billionaire does not want to be seen as ruling space. They want to be seen as enabling systems. This is why their most significant investments are intangible. Code, platforms, intellectual property, networks. These assets are difficult to visualize, which makes them difficult to moralize against directly. Their consequences can be debated endlessly without a single symbol anchoring outrage. The mansion, by contrast, anchors outrage perfectly. Another factor sealing its fate is the collapse of domestic hierarchy. The Gilded Age mansion relied on rigid social stratification. Servants lived on site, often in conditions starkly inferior to the family they served. Their invisibility was part of the design. Separate staircases, service corridors, back entrances. Architecture encoded inequality spatially. Modern societies reject that model explicitly, even when inequality persists implicitly. The idea of dozens of live-in servants dedicated to one family clashes with contemporary norms about dignity and labor rights. Even the wealthy are uncomfortable with such arrangements, not only because of cost, but because of optics. The image of servitude is politically radioactive. Outsourcing solved this problem. Services are now contracted, automated, or geographically displaced. Labor still exists, but it is no longer spatially subordinate. The mansion, which depends on spatial hierarchy, cannot adapt to this change without losing its function. There is also a technological dimension. Biltmore was a technological marvel in its time because technology required space. Boilers, generators, storage rooms, kitchens, and service areas occupied enormous physical footprints. Modern technology compresses, infrastructure shrinks, control panels replace mechanical rooms, software replaces staff. The functional justification for scale has evaporated. When space no longer serves function, it must serve symbolism. And symbolism is exactly what modern wealth avoids. The mansion also conflicts with the tempo of modern life. Vanderbilt lived slowly. Travel took days. Communication took weeks. Hosting required extended stays. A house designed for prolonged presence made sense. Modern elites live at speed. They move constantly. They operate across time zones. Their schedules are fragmented. A house designed for permanence and routine does not match that rhythm. This mismatch explains why even large modern homes feel temporary. They are designed for short stays, not rooted lives. The mansion assumes continuity. Modern wealth assumes interruption. Interruption has become the dominant mode of elite existence. This has implications for identity. Vanderbilt's identity was inseparable from Biltmore. It embodied his tastes, values, and worldview. Modern elites resist such embodiment. They cultivate identities that are flexible, rebrandable, and adaptable. A house that defines you becomes a constraint. The same logic applies to companies. Corporate headquarters once symbolized stability. Today, companies emphasize agility, remote work, distributed teams, cloud infrastructure. Physical presence becomes optional. The cultural shift away from fixed structures is systemic, not limited to residences. In this context, the mansion appears as a relic of an older ontology, a belief that power must occupy space to exist. Modern power occupies processes. This transformation has altered how wealth is challenged. In the Gilded Age, reformers targeted visible structures. Trust-busting aimed at identifiable monopolies. Labor movements confronted factories and mansions. The architecture of power provided focal points. Modern reform struggles precisely because such focal points are absent. Power is diffuse, layered, and abstract. Challenging it requires technical expertise, sustained attention, and institutional capacity. Public anger, which once found targets easily, now dissipates. The mansion's disappearance thus contributes to political inertia. Without symbols, mobilization weakens. Biltmore inadvertently preserves that lost dynamic. It allows people to feel inequality rather than calculate it. That feeling matters. It produces clarity. This is why Biltmore remains controversial even as a museum. It evokes admiration and discomfort simultaneously. It forces confrontation with excess. Modern wealth avoids that confrontation by design. The educational value of Biltmore lies in its honesty. It does not pretend to be efficient or benevolent. It simply exists. Its scale speaks for itself. Modern elite structures speak in press releases. This honesty is dangerous in the present tense. The modern billionaire understands that every visible artifact becomes evidence. Evidence invites judgment. Judgment invites action. The safest wealth is wealth that leaves no artifacts. The mansion, therefore, is not just obsolete. it is actively counterproductive. This conclusion is reinforced by global comparison. In emerging economies, where wealth concentration is newer and social contracts less settled, elites still build palaces. These structures often provoke unrest. They become symbols of corruption, cronyism, and inequality. History repeats itself. Visibility generates backlash. Over time, elites adapt or fall. American elites adapted early. They learned from the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and mid-century taxation that visibility carries cost. They internalized that lesson and passed it on institutionally. The result is a class that is wealthier than ever and harder to see than ever. The mansion died because it could not evolve into invisibility. This does not mean architecture has no future role in expressing wealth. It means that any such expression must be reframed as collective. Stadiums, cultural centers, research institutes. These structures channel capital into visible forms while dispersing ownership and credit. They allow elites to participate in monumentality without personal attribution. Even then, naming rights are increasingly subtle. Branding replaces ownership. Influence is exercised through sponsorship rather than residence. Biltmore's name remains attached because it predates these norms. It could never be built under them. The broader lesson is unsettling. Wealth no longer seeks to be remembered. It seeks to persist. Memory can invite judgment. Persistence avoids it. Future generations may inherit enormous systems of power with little physical trace of who built them or how. They may understand the consequences without seeing the causes. Biltmore stands as a counterexample, a moment when wealth carved its presence into the land and could not erase it later. That permanence became its vulnerability, but it also became its legacy. No billionaire will ever build a mansion like Biltmore again, because doing so would require believing that wealth deserves to be seen. Modern wealth no longer believes that. It believes in endurance without exposure, influence without attribution, power without place. The mansion was the last honest expression of private excess. Everything that followed learned to lie more effectively. And that is why Biltmore remains singular, not just in size, but in meaning. The final reason no billionaire will ever build a mansion, like Biltmore again, is not financial, legal, or technological. It is existential. The mansion belonged to an era that believed the future would resemble the past. Modern wealth exists in a world that expects rupture. George Vanderbilt assumed continuity. He assumed that America would remain politically stable, socially stratified, and economically permissive. He assumed that his descendants would inherit not only his fortune, but the conditions that allowed it to exist. The mansion was built on that assumption. It was a bet on permanence. Modern elites make the opposite bet. They assume disruption as the default condition. Economic shocks, political polarization, climate instability, technological upheaval, social backlash. Every major planning decision made by contemporary wealth managers begins with the question, what happens if the system changes suddenly? The answer is never architectural. A mansion assumes the system will protect it. Modern wealth assumes the system may turn hostile. This expectation reshapes everything. It explains why modern elites prioritize liquidity, diversification, and jurisdictional flexibility. It explains why wealth is increasingly decoupled from nationality, place, and even industry. The goal is not dominance within a system, but survivability across systems. The mansion fails this test completely. A 250-room house is the opposite of resilient. It cannot be moved. It cannot be hidden. It cannot be repurposed quickly. It depends on stable labor markets, predictable taxation, and social acceptance. It is fragile precisely because it is grand. In contrast, modern wealth constructs redundancy. Multiple residences, multiple citizenships, multiple asset classes, multiple narratives. If one element fails, the others compensate. The mansion offers no redundancy. It concentrates risk. This logic becomes especially clear when viewed through the lens of climate change. Large, fixed structures face increasing exposure to environmental risk. Flooding, fires, hurricanes, drought, and rising insurance costs threaten long-term viability. A mansion built to last centuries now faces uncertainty over decades. Modern elites respond by dispersing assets geographically and structurally. Again, the mansion resists dispersion. Climate risk also reframes moral judgment. Excessive consumption of land, energy, and materials invites criticism in a world increasingly conscious of ecological limits. Even when such criticism is selective or inconsistent, it shapes behavior. Modern wealth is careful to avoid becoming an easy target. The mansion is an easy target. There is also a philosophical shift at work. The Gilded Age elite believed in legacy as inheritance. Modern elites believe in legacy as impact. The difference is subtle but profound. Inheritance focuses on what is passed down. Impact focuses on what is changed. A mansion preserves status. A foundation claims to change the world. Whether that claim is valid is secondary. What matters is that it aligns with contemporary values. A mansion does not. It preserves a past hierarchy rather than addressing future problems. This alignment is strategic. Modern elites understand that legitimacy now flows through problem-solving narratives: climate, health, education, technology, space. These domains offer opportunities to frame wealth as necessary rather than excessive. Architecture offers no such framing. The result is a complete inversion of priorities. Vanderbilt invested his surplus in stone. Modern elites invest surplus in influence. The former produced beauty and resentment. The latter produces power and ambiguity. Ambiguity is safer. This safety comes at a cost. When wealth becomes too abstract, it escapes not only criticism, but understanding. Societies struggle to govern what they cannot conceptualize. The mansion made inequality visible and therefore governable. Its disappearance complicates democratic response. This is not a moral argument. It is a structural one. Power that cannot be seen is harder to regulate. Power that leaves no trace is harder to contest. Biltmore survives as a reminder of when power still left footprints. The irony is that Vanderbilt's mansion, built as a private retreat, ultimately became public infrastructure. It employs thousands. It anchors regional tourism. It preserves crafts and history. It generates economic activity far beyond its original purpose. In its afterlife, it serves society more effectively than it ever served its builder. Modern elite structures rarely offer such afterlives. Platforms can collapse. Foundations can dissolve. Algorithms can be rewritten. There is little guarantee that today's instruments of power will remain accessible or interpretable in the future. They are optimized for present influence, not historical memory. Future generations may inherit consequences without context. This is why Biltmore remains compelling. It is a physical argument. It makes a claim about wealth that cannot be edited or rebranded. It simply exists. Visitors can walk its halls and draw their own conclusions. Modern wealth avoids such encounters. The absence of new Biltmores is therefore not a failure of imagination. It is evidence of adaptation. The wealthy learned that the mansion made them vulnerable. They learned that visibility invites reform. They learned that permanence invites redistribution. They responded by abandoning monumentality altogether. This adaptation has been extraordinarily successful. Wealth concentration today exceeds Gilded Age levels. Influence penetrates deeper into policy, media, and daily life. The elite are more powerful and less visible than ever before. The mansion, once the ultimate, expression of dominance, became a liability that taught the wrong lesson. That lesson was learned completely. If a modern billionaire were to announce plans to build a new Biltmore, the response would be swift and unforgiving. Environmental reviews would stall the project, political opposition would mobilize, media scrutiny would intensify. The builder would become a symbol of everything society claims to reject. The project would collapse under its own visibility. No advisor would allow it. No strategist would recommend it. No wealth manager would endorse it. Not because it is impossible, but because it is irrational. The mansion belongs to a moment when wealth still believed it could stand alone, insulated from society. That belief died with the progressive era and never returned. Modern wealth survives by embedding itself within systems so complex that no single structure can represent it. Biltmore stands alone because it is an artifact of a vanished worldview. It marks the end of an age when power thought it could be honest. No billionaire will ever build a mansion like Biltmore again, not because they lack resources, but because they lack the illusion that such a thing could ever be safe.